Most family fortunes don't die from market crashes. They die from birthday parties, from boardroom arguments turned into living room grudges, from entitlement disguised as tradition. 90% of wealth gone by the third generation. That's not a statistic, it's a pattern. Because making money is a skill, but keeping it is a war. A silent war fought behind closed doors, where trust funds can't protect you, and where the greatest threat shares your last name. Today, you're about to see the 7 silent rules that decide one thing: whether your family becomes a dynasty or just another cautionary tale. And it all starts with the rule most families break first, even before they realize they're losing control.
The Vanderbilt family built one of the greatest fortunes in American history: railroads, shipping, real estate. By the late 1800s, they were royalty without titles. But within 3 generations, the fortune was gone. Not because the assets disappeared, but because control did. Here's the trap. Ownership makes you feel powerful, but control is what keeps you powerful. When families spread ownership without governance, when every cousin, uncle, and in-law gets a piece, decision-making turns into emotional warfare. One wants to sell, one wants to hold, one wants to cash out for a yacht. And little by little, decisions become diluted, vision becomes blurred, and the fortune begins to leak. That's why the families that survive separate emotional ties from business decisions. The Rockefellers didn't just pass down money, they passed down control mechanisms, voting rights, family councils, decision protocols, unseen by the public, but ironclad behind the scenes, because without centralized control, wealth becomes a democracy of chaos, and that's how legacies start to crack. But here's the part most families never see coming. Even with perfect control structures, there's still one variable no contract can fix: leadership. Because when the next generation steps in, the fortune either evolves or starts counting its final days. Control can protect the structure, but it can't protect the people inside it. Because every family eventually faces the same silent question: who's next? And history is brutal to families that get this wrong. Let's talk about the Guinness family. By the 1930s, their wealth was legendary: beer empires, real estate, global influence. But with each succession, leadership became less about competence and more about entitlement. Positions were inherited, not earned. Decisions driven by emotion, not strategy. The result? Feuds, legal battles, and a fortune that began to fracture from within. This is the Heir dilemma. Wealth creates comfort, comfort creates detachment, and detachment creates collapse. Because raising an heir is not about giving them money, it's about giving them responsibility long before the money arrives. The families that endure don't wait for a crisis. They build leadership pipelines inside the family. They expose the next generation to decision-making, to failure, to consequence. Walmart's Walton family did it. Before handing over real power, they involved the next generation in governance, operations, philanthropy. They weren't just heirs, they became stewards. Because here's the uncomfortable truth: you can't outsource leadership. You can hire managers. You can bring in consultants. But if the family at the top isn't prepared, the empire turns vulnerable. And this vulnerability doesn't stay hidden for long. It shows up in board meetings, in shareholder revolts, and sometimes in the most dangerous place of all, the dinner table. Because when power shifts without preparation, the cracks don't start with the business, they start with the people, sitting right across from each other at Sunday lunch. And that's when the third, even deadlier force enters the game: entitlement. By the time the third generation arrives, something dangerous has already settled in. Not market risk, not legal disputes, but mindset decay. It starts small, private jets without understanding the fuel cost, trust fund withdrawals treated like monthly salaries, business decisions made from vacation homes. And soon, the family tree grows more branches but fewer roots. The Pritzker family, founders of the Hyatt hotel empire, faced this head-on. After decades of building, the family fortune became the target of internal lawsuits. Over 10 years of legal war between siblings and cousins, fighting not for survival, but for entitlement. Because that's the truth most families ignore. Wealth, in the wrong hands, becomes poison. Here's how the entitlement trap works. The first generation builds. The second manages. The third consumes. And by the time the fourth arrives, there's often nothing left to consume. The problem isn't just spending, it's identity. When children grow up knowing they're beneficiaries but never contributors, they start to believe the wealth exists for them. Private schools, luxury lifestyles, zero accountability. And little by little, the hunger that built the fortune is replaced by expectation. That's why the most resilient families engineer discipline into the system. Not by cutting access to money, but by making access conditional on contribution. Some families require heirs to hold external jobs before joining family boards. Others mandate philanthropic leadership or formal education in governance and finance. It's not about punishment, it's about inoculation. Because once entitlement spreads, it's almost impossible to reverse. And the signs appear fast: declining business performance, rising personal debt, and the most lethal symptom of all, the belief that the money will always be there. But here's the irony. While most families worry about protecting the fortune from outsiders, the real damage usually comes from within. And that internal erosion leads directly to the next rule. Because even the best families can't survive without one thing that every dynasty eventually needs: a governance system that anticipates collapse before it happens. Most families don't notice the moment decay begins. It doesn't start with bankruptcy or a failed investment. It starts with silence. Decisions that used to happen quickly now stall for months. Family meetings turn into arguments. Succession plans sit unsigned in drawers. Because without governance, wealth drifts into chaos. The Gallo family, behind one of the largest wine empires in the world, faced this reality. Two brothers, millions in revenue, but no clear decision-making structure. What followed was one of the most brutal family legal battles in corporate history. Years of lawsuits, public humiliation, and a business that nearly collapsed under the weight of internal conflict. The lesson? Informal trust between siblings isn't a governance system. Here's the hard truth. As the family grows, so does the complexity, and what worked with 3 people fails with 30. That's why dynasties build governance frameworks that evolve with scale. Family constitutions, voting protocols, dispute resolution mechanisms, clear roles, defined rights, and unbreakable rules of engagement. Not because they expect harmony, but because they expect conflict and prepare for it. Governance isn't about stopping fights. It's about making sure the fights don't destroy the fortune. The Rothschilds understood this. For centuries, they operated like a multinational corporation long before the term even existed. Family councils, intergenerational mentoring, and a relentless focus on keeping decision-making above personal emotion. Because without structure, every disagreement
becomes a threat to the legacy. And here's the part most families never realize until it's too late. Once decay sets in, it accelerates. One bad decision leads to another, and soon the entire system starts to collapse under its own weight. But even with perfect governance, there's still one factor that no protocol can fully control: time. Because as generations pass, there's one silent force always working against every fortune: entropy. And the next rule is all about fighting that invisible enemy before it swallows everything.
Wealth doesn't just erode from spending. It erodes from stagnation. Because money that sits starts dying. Slowly at first, then all at once. Many family fortunes make the same fatal mistake. They treat wealth like a trophy, not like a tool. The DuPont family, one of America's oldest industrial dynasties, learned this lesson the hard way. After generations of dominance in chemicals and manufacturing, their internal investment discipline began to fracture. Profits were distributed, but not replenished. Dividends took priority over innovation, and over time, the empire that once fueled American industry started bleeding relevance and revenue. Because here's the truth: wealth is like a living organism. It needs to grow just to survive. Families that endure treat reinvestment as non-negotiable. They don't just distribute profits, they recycle them into new businesses, new ventures, new opportunities that outpace inflation, taxation, and time. The Mars family, owners of the global candy empire, have operated for generations with an almost obsessive reinvestment strategy. Private ownership, aggressive capital allocation, and long-term vision over short-term gratification. Because when families stop investing, the fortune starts feeding on itself. Liquidity dries up. Assets get sold to cover lifestyle inflation, and soon, what once felt infinite becomes dangerously finite. And this erosion doesn't just show up on financial statements. It shows up when heirs start liquidating legacy assets, selling family homes, breaking apart core businesses, not out of strategy, but out of necessity. And here's the irony most families ignore. The market doesn't destroy family wealth. Inflation doesn't destroy it. Even recessions rarely destroy it. What destroys it is the failure to adapt, the refusal to evolve, and the comfort of assuming the money will outlive the family. But discipline isn't enough on its own, because even the most disciplined families face a much larger silent threat: the external world. Laws change, markets shift, technology disrupts. And the families that survive aren't the ones with the biggest fortunes, they're the ones with the fastest reflexes. And that brings us to the next rule, the one that separates the static from the untouchable: adaptability. Wealth loves routine, but markets punish predictability. What made a family rich in one decade can bankrupt them in the next. And yet, most family fortunes cling to what worked before: old business models, outdated investments, comfortable but dangerous traditions. The Kodak family is a perfect example. For decades, they dominated photography. The brand was iconic, the profits unstoppable. But when digital technology emerged, they hesitated. They protected legacy cash flows, ignored internal warnings, and refused to pivot. By the time they reacted, it was too late. Generational wealth wiped out by a single wave of innovation. Because here's the brutal law no family escapes: markets don't wait for legacies. The families that endure don't just build businesses, they build reflexes. The Agnelli family, owners of Fiat and other global assets,
survived world wars, economic crashes, and industry disruption, not by luck, but by shifting strategies, industries, and even leadership styles before external forces forced them. Adaptability isn't about chasing trends. It's about reading signals before the crisis arrives. Shifting from manufacturing to tech, from real estate to private equity, from domestic markets to global diversification, because wealth is a moving target. And here's the part most families overlook. Adaptability isn't just financial, it's cultural. The way a family communicates, makes decisions, recruits external advisors, and educates the next generation. All of it must evolve. Static families die slow. Reactive families die fast. Only adaptive families stay standing. But even adaptability has a limit. Because after all the governance, all the reinvestment, all the leadership planning, there's still one final invisible force that decides whether a family becomes a dynasty or disappears into history books. And that force is legacy thinking, the ability to think beyond yourself. For most people, wealth is about lifestyle. For dynasties, wealth is about time. The difference? One thinks in decades, the other in centuries. Because real legacy isn't about what you build, it's about what survives you. The Carnegie family understood this. Andrew Carnegie didn't just accumulate wealth, he engineered its afterlife. Universities, libraries, endowments that still exist over a century later. He knew money fades, but impact compounds. Legacy thinking forces uncomfortable questions. What values will survive me? What structures will outlive me? What decisions am I making today that my great-grandchildren will inherit for better or worse? Because here's the truth most families refuse to face. Wealth without purpose becomes noise. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Philanthropic Trusts, these weren't PR moves. They were strategic shields designed to protect both wealth and reputation for generations. Legacy thinking changes the conversation at the family table from how much can we take to how much should we protect, from what's our lifestyle goal to what's our impact horizon. And this mindset shift is often the final firewall between longevity and collapse. Because when legacy becomes bigger than any single heir, egos shrink, decisions sharpen, and the family starts playing a different game, a longer game. But here's the part that no trust fund, no governance system, and no inheritance lawyer can guarantee. Legacy thinking is a choice. It's the final filter, the invisible test that every family faces when the cameras are off, when the advisors leave the room, and when it's just them and the weight of what they've built. So now the real question isn't, will you build wealth? It's, will your great-grandchildren still have it? Most people spend their lives chasing wealth, but the ultra-wealthy spend their lives trying to keep it. Because the real enemy of fortune isn't the market, it's erosion from within, lack of control, weak leadership, entitlement, governance failure, stagnation, inflexibility, and short-term thinking. 7 silent forces that decide whether your family name becomes a dynasty or just a forgotten line in financial history. And here's the part no one tells you. This isn't a lesson for billionaires. It's a lesson for anyone building something worth keeping. Because legacies don't die in a single moment. They die one small decision at a time. So now the question is yours. Will your family be one of the few that understands the rules before it's too late?
If this video opened your eyes, if you know someone who needs to hear this, like, comment, share. Because some truths aren't just worth hearing, they're worth passing down.